They made me sit down like a dog. They would hold the string from the bag. They made me bark like a dog, and they were laughing at me. One of the police was telling me to crawl in Arabic, so I crawled on my stomach, and the police were spitting on me when I was crawling and hitting me. Then the police started beating me on my kidneys, and then they hit me on my right ear, and it started bleeding, and I lost consciousness. A few days before they hit me on my ear, the American police, the guy who wears glasses, he put red woman's underwear over my head. Then he tied me to the window that's in the cell with my hands behind my back until I lost consciousness. And also, when I was in room number 1, they told me to lay down on my stomach, and they were jumping from the bed onto my back and my legs. And the other 2 were spitting on me and calling me names, and they held my hands and legs. After the guy with the glasses got tired, 2 of the American soldiers brought me to the ground and tied my hands to the door while laying down on my stomach. One of the police was pissing on me and laughing. The soldier and his friend told me in a loud voice to lie down, so I did that. And then the policeman was opening my legs with a bag over my head, and he sat down between my legs on his knees, and I was looking at him from under the bag, and he was opening his pants, so I started screaming loudly, and the other police started hitting me with his feet on my neck, and he put his feet on my head so I couldn't scream. And then they put the loudspeaker inside the room, and they closed the door, and he was yelling in the microphone. They took me to the room, and they signaled me to get onto the floor. And one of the police, he put a part of his stick that he always carries inside my ass, and I felt it going inside me about 2 centimeters approximately. I started screaming, and he pulled it out, and he washed it with water inside the room. And then 2 American girls that were there when they were beating me, they were hitting me with a ball on my dick. And when I was tied up in the room, one of the girls with blonde hair, she is white, she was playing with my dick, and they were taking pictures of me during all these instances. That was a sworn statement by a former detainee at Abu Ghraib prison, given to the U.S. military's Criminal Investigation Division, and eventually obtained by the Washington Post. This kind of treatment was not an aberration or an accident. In fact, it was part of a system specifically designed by the American government to circumvent international law. The system worked. In the early and mid-2000s, the U.S. government tortured thousands of individuals in secret prisons around the globe. Despite the government's declarations, this was still a failure on many fronts, both humanitarian and tactical. This failure was born out of a willful ignorance and the careful manipulation of the public psyche, media apparatuses, and international treaties. Confronting the idea of torture brings us to many difficult questions. Can it be effective? What happens to the tortured human in the real world, outside of media depictions and hypothetical scenarios? The answers to these questions are certainly not simple, but they are critical. The fact is, we have been lied to, we have been deceived en masse with great and cruel intention. Abu Ghraib was a maximum security prison in Iraq, which was originally opened and maintained by Saddam Hussein. Under Hussein, it mostly held political prisoners and dissidents. At its peak, the grossly overpopulated facility housed 50,000 inmates with 150 prisoners packed into rooms designed for just 24. Abu Ghraib had a well-deserved, fearsome reputation. It featured a number of dedicated torture chambers and gallows rooms. The U.S. occupation of Iraq began in 2003, and shortly thereafter, the capital city of Baghdad fell. In the chaos, Iraqis destroyed Abu Ghraib prison. But only a few months later, the American-led occupying coalition renovated and reopened the facility. After the renovation, Brigadier General Janis L. Karpinski claimed that staying in the prison was like a vacation, and that, quote, "we were concerned they wouldn't want to leave." Of course, this was untrue. Abu Ghraib soon became hell itself on earth. Under U.S. operation, the prison was quickly populated by alleged detainees and insurgents. Alleged is an important word here. The International Committee of the Red Cross sent investigators to examine American conduct in Iraq around this time. Their report describes a, quote, fairly consistent pattern that reads, arresting authorities entered houses usually after dark, breaking down doors, waking up residents roughly, yelling orders, forcing family members into one room under military guard while searching the rest of the house, and further breaking doors, cabinets, and other property. They arrested suspects tying their hands in the back with flexi cuffs, hooding them, and taking them away. Sometimes they arrested all adult males present in a house, including elderly, handicapped, or sick people. They were pushing people around, insulting, taking aim with rifles, punching and kicking and striking with rifles. The report further noted that, quote, in almost all instances, arresting authorities provided no information about who they were, where their base was located, nor did they explain the cause of arrest. Similarly, they rarely informed the arrestee or his family where he was being taken and for how long, resulting in the de facto disappearance of the arrestee. War is a brutal and dark place. While the above is certainly remarkable, it does not come as altogether surprising in the context of armed conflict. But we must consider two things. First, that the Iraq invasion was largely illegitimate. Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, nor was Iraq connected to 9/11 in any way. There is, of course, much more to be said for this, but we will save that for another essay. Secondly, we must consider who was being arrested, who populated Abu Ghraib. At our harshest, we can support American behavior by saying the ends justify the means. We can say Americans were arresting terrorists and committing sins for a greater good. But to say this would be false. According to the Red Cross report, military intelligence officers themselves estimated that between 70 and 90% of the persons arrested in Iraq were innocent civilians detained by mistake. So already Abu Ghraib is becoming an abyss. It was a place where one was banished, seemingly very much at random. And indeed, the prison quickly fulfilled its promise once it was populated. The Red Cross also sent investigators to Abu Ghraib specifically. These investigators broadly described conduct at the prison, saying, quote, methods of physical and psychological coercion were used by the military intelligence in a systematic way to gain confessions and extract information or other forms of cooperation from persons who had been arrested in connection with suspected security offenses or deemed to have an intelligence value. Again, no great surprise here. American military were interrogating suspects. But the Red Cross report goes on to detail these methods, and that is where things take a notably darker turn. Investigators witnessed a number of techniques in use by the American coalition. One was hooding. This is the simple act of placing a plastic or cloth bag over a person's head to eliminate the sense of vision. It can be, and at Abu Ghraib was, also used to impede breathing. Often a person was hooded and then beaten. The hood increased anxiety through the beatings. Hooding also allowed interrogators to remain anonymous to the detainee, which let the captors act without fear of punishment. During hooding, detainees were often exposed to dangerously high levels of noise for several hours, or left in the sun in temperatures exceeding 122 degrees Fahrenheit. At Abu Ghraib, hooding lasted anywhere from a few hours to 4 consecutive days. The Americans also handcuffed detainees using flexi cuffs, which are essentially zip ties. The interrogators typically tightened the flexi cuffs enough to deliberately cause lacerations and long-term nerve damage. They also used flexi cuffs to attach detainees to cell doors while naked or in forced stress positions. Interrogators at Abu Ghraib additionally beat prisoners with a number of implements, including pistols and rifles. They also slapped, punched, and kicked detainees on the legs, sides, lower back, or groin. The Americans forced captives to walk naked around the prison in view of fellow prisoners and prison guards. During this exposure, detainees were sometimes hooded with cloth bags or women's underwear. When the Red Cross visited the so-titled isolated section of Abu Ghraib, they witnessed especially brutal interrogation methods firsthand. American forces broke chemical lights and poured phosphoric acid on detainees. Interrogators beat and sodomized detainees with a broomstick. They attacked the prisoners with dogs. A number of photos were taken by American forces during these interrogations. They were produced to use as blackmail against inmates. As part of the interrogation process, captors threatened to release these photos to the detainees' friends, family, or colleagues. But many of these images leaked to the public. The photos became infamous symbols of Abu Ghraib and larger American brutality in the Middle East. This is one of those photos. It shows Private First Class Lindy England. She is posed with a body, grinning at the camera, pointing to a man's genitals, and showing a thumbs up. This body belonged to Haider Sabar Ab, or Abu Ghraib prisoner number 13077. Prior to the American invasion, Ab served in the Iraqi army for 18 years. When he tried to get out of a taxi at a military checkpoint in June of 2003, he was arrested and brought to Abu Ghraib. Ab was never charged with a crime, nor questioned prior to arriving at the prison. He later told the New York Times, quote, "We were not terrorists. We were not insurgents. We were just ordinary people, and American intelligence knew this." Ab later recounted a night in Abu Ghraib. American forces corralled 7 men, including Ab. They pulled black hoods over their heads and began to slam their heads against the concrete walls and doors. The Americans broke Ab's jaw, and Ab estimates they struck him about 50 times during the 2-hour beating. The interrogators then told all 7 men to strip naked. The prisoners informed them that they were Muslims and that to strip would violate religious principles. The interrogators beat the men and tore their clothes off with a knife. This is when the photo of Private England was taken. The interrogators then told Ab to masturbate while looking at Private England as she squeezed her breasts. Ab said he couldn't do it. The interrogators beat him again. Ab placed his hand on his own penis while the interrogators took dozens of photos. The Red Cross medical delegates sent to Abu Ghraib examined a number of prisoners. Among these inmates, they found concentration difficulties, memory problems, verbal expression difficulties, incoherent speech, abnormal behavior, and suicidal tendencies, which, quote, appeared to have been caused by the interrogations. The Red Cross, of course, asked military officials about what they'd witnessed at Abu Ghraib. The response was remarkably blasé. The military officer in charge of the interrogations offered a vague explanation. He said the methods were, quote, part of a process. This process, he also noted, had been used by American interrogators in a number of secret prisons around the world post 9/11. There was a shortage of troops for deployment in Iraq across various roles. So low-ranking military policemen like Private England, who had no interrogation training, were assigned to, quote, soften up prisoners. The directions these police got from senior officers were vague. The police were told things like, make sure he has a bad night, or make sure he gets the treatment. There was also, in the Red Cross report, a bizarre tendency among military command to simply pass the buck. One sergeant was quoted as saying he assumed that if they were doing things out of the ordinary, someone would have said something. The military's rather casual attitude about the Abu Ghraib torture was sickly justified. No matter what the Red Cross found or published, the interrogators needn't worry. The conduct at Abu Ghraib was not an accident or an isolated incident. Instead, American policy at the prison was dictated, sanctioned, and endorsed by the Bush administration. The Bush administration created the horrors of Abu Ghraib in 3 ways. The first was blatant manipulation of international laws. After 9/11, the Bush administration decided that corrupting these laws would allow them to more easily win the so-called War on Terror. This process began in earnest with the now famous Guantanamo Bay prison in Cuba. In January of 2002, the United States began sending Afghan detainees to Guantanamo Bay. The Americans specifically chose the Cuban location because it put the detainees outside of the jurisdiction of U.S. courts. This worked quite well. When some inmates later tried to bring a legal challenge over the treatment of detainees at Guantanamo, the administration nullified their efforts. They claimed that U.S. courts did not have jurisdiction in Cuba, and so the challenge could not be brought at all. The Geneva Conventions are a set of international humanitarian laws that establish legal standards for the treatment of victims of war and armed conflicts. In short, they protect civilians, wounded combatants, and prisoners of war. As part of the strategy to undermine international laws like the Geneva Conventions, then U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld decided to label Guantanamo detainees as unlawful combatants rather than prisoners of war. This was a bold idea and borderline nonsensical. The U.S. stated that members of the Taliban would not be treated as POWs because they did not meet the standard of being an armed force fighting for a state party. But indeed, the Taliban controlled Afghanistan for many years. They even had, and currently have, the alternate name of Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Certainly we wade into dangerous waters if we fight for the rights of the Taliban, but we must remember the vast majority of people detained at places like Abu Ghraib were not affiliated with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or any terrorist group. So it is not for the sake of terrorists that this POW/unlawful combatant delineation matters, but for the innocents who were tortured at Abu Ghraib. As Donald Rumsfeld publicly said, under the classification of unlawful combatant, detainees at Guantanamo would not have any rights under the Geneva Conventions. Another White House counsel, Alberto R. Gonzales, urged the president to take Rumsfeld's strategy. He said that it would preserve, quote, flexibility for the U.S. in the war against terror. He further noted that U.S. officials could be charged with war crimes if they tortured people who did have Geneva protections. In February 2002, international criticism began to pile on the Bush administration. As many rightly noted, the U.S. was effectively rewriting the Geneva Conventions to suit their own needs. So in response, Bush announced that the U.S. government would, quote, apply the principles of the Third Geneva Convention and treat detainees humanely. Alongside this unspecific declaration, Bush doubled down on his decision to not grant these detainees prisoner of war status. This would mean they did not have any protection against torture. And so the American government proceeded as planned, with their wild interpretation of international law perfectly intact. The second of the three strategies used by the Bush administration was also quite intentional. At prisons like Guantanamo Bay and others in Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States began to use methods to, quote, soften up detainees prior to interrogation. These included techniques like we discussed above, hooding, sleep deprivation, exposure, etc., along with notably more brutal methods. In one incident, a Guantanamo Bay detainee was interrogated for 20 hours per day for 7 weeks. During this time, he was stripped, made to wear women's underwear, forcibly injected with IV fluid, forced to urinate himself, led around on a leash, and made to bark like a dog. In another incident, U.S. military officials pureed a mixture of hummus, pasta, nuts, and raisins before injecting it into a detainee's anus. These sort of techniques established a new norm in American-run military prisons around the world. Nobody really knows what level of government authorized these kinds of things, but it was certainly not caused by solo, aberrant bad apples. A captain at Abu Ghraib posted interrogation rules of engagement, which authorized methods that violated numerous international anti-torture laws, including the Geneva Conventions. Similar methods were indeed used around the Middle East, initially by higher-ranking members of the military. And so, taking example from their superiors, lower-ranking officers also began to employ these tactics. Third, and certainly not least, the Bush administration turned a blind eye to any and all mistreatment of detainees. The administration did not institute any meaningful policies which would protect captives from violent coercive methods. When the Red Cross initially discovered violent torture, Army officials' first move was, in fact, to restrict any further Red Cross access. Investigations into wrongful deaths went unsolved. Personnel accused of abuse were let free. Various human rights organizations and journalists warned U.S. officials repeatedly about violent torture of detainees from 2002 to 2004. These warnings went ignored, or worse. In 2002, at Bagram Air Base, 2 detainees died under mysterious circumstances. One was a 22-year-old man named Dilawar, who the military publicly insisted died of a heart attack. But the official, leaked U.S. military autopsy of Dilawar's body concluded that his cause of death was, quote, blunt force injuries to lower extremities. That same autopsy noted the mode of death was homicide. There was also a 30-year-old named Habibullah. Again, the leaked U.S. military autopsy ruled the cause of his death to be, quote, pulmonary embolism due to blunt force injury. It is worth noting that years later, in 2012, many members of the U.S. military were charged with crimes relating to these particular incidents. It is also worth noting the results of these charges. As we look at the punishments issued, we find borderline impunity. A few individuals involved were sent to jail for 60 or 90 days. Many were simply given letters of reprimand. Several others were acquitted entirely. Altogether, up until President Bush declared his ostensible end to the Iraq combat operations in 2003, the U.S. detained 12,000 Iraqis for periods exceeding several weeks. And once again, according to the military apparatus itself, 70 to 90% of those in custody were arrested, quote, by mistake. All of this is to say the horrors of Abu Ghraib were no aberration. As scattershot as the torturing was, it was part of a concerted effort and undertaken within a system of belief. So what exactly is that system? Why did the Americans believe torture to be so important? What is the case for torture? Certainly, beyond the shadow of a doubt, there are individuals who torture others out of pure sadism. But also certainly, torture exists as the result of a broader, more utilitarian thought process. Before we are able to effectively dismantle this thought process, we must make an effort to understand it. At its most base level, torture is the attempt to force information retrieval from the brain of the unwilling. People do not like discomfort or pain, so by forcing these feelings onto an individual, they will eventually break. The idea of breaking a person is core to the philosophy of torture. Some U.S. government officials have been quite direct in endorsing this idea. When asked about U.S. Senator John McCain's repudiation of torture, former U.S. presidential candidate Rick Santorum replied, quote, "He doesn't understand how enhanced interrogation works. I mean, you break somebody, and after they've broken, they become cooperative." Senator John McCain was tortured in Vietnam for 5 consecutive years. Rick Santorum never served in a military position. The primary dubious source of breaking a person comes from a sort of folk knowledge of the human mind. People don't like pain, so they cooperate. But folk knowledge is not always real knowledge. As author Shane O'Meara has noted, generations of educated people believed that the sun traveled around the earth. This explained night and day quite simply, despite not having any scientific basis. This sort of belief is common in thinking about human behavior. For example, we say we drink water because we are thirsty. This is true to a degree, but imagine you were in some extraordinary circumstance, like being stranded on a desert island. In that sort of scenario, the folk understanding of hydration meets the barriers of reality. We must drink water, yes, but not immediately. We actually have about 3 days before we die of dehydration. There is also water all around us in the form of salt water, but drinking this will actually dehydrate our bodies. Thirst should rather be understood as the end point in a long, complex chain of physiological processes. So our simple understanding of the human body, which says we drink to satiate thirst, is true. However, when applied to more remarkable situations, this explanation begins to break down because of its vagueness. Later in this essay, we will dissect how precisely this applies to torture, but for now, we can understand that one part of the pro-torture argument is this simplified, base understanding of the human mind. Still, there is more to the picture. Aside from basic explanations for human behavior, one of the more popular pro-torture arguments is a ticking time bomb scenario. This usually goes something like the following. Imagine a bomb has been planted which will kill a large number of innocent civilians. The authorities have detained the man who has planted the bomb, but the man refuses to disclose the bomb's location. If torturing the man is the only way to find the bomb and save countless innocents, are we not morally obligated to torture him? Most people, given this scenario alone, would probably agree that the man should be tortured and would couch their response with remarks about hard decisions, saving lives, or other appropriately apologetic language. Indeed, the ticking time bomb scenario has been used to justify countless amounts of torture throughout history. Paired with a simplified view of the human psyche, this scenario, or many like it, provide a platform for the act of torture. Again, this is something we will dissect in the next section of this essay. But there is still one more piece of this pro-torture puzzle. That is an alleged lack of evidence to the contrary. In theory, it is very difficult to research the efficacy of torture. Certainly, it would be unheard of in modern times to torture test subjects in a controlled environment, and indeed such a study is missing from scientific literature. So administrations like Bush's during the Iraq War have generally neglected to conduct research. They have instead preferred to side with intuition and personal preference. A 2004 report from the U.S. Inspector General regarding torture reads that there was, quote, limited data on which to assess effectiveness. Notably, discussion on the efficacy of torture comprises just 5 pages of this 250-page document. According to a 2012 Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, also known as the Torture Report, it was not possible to assess the effectiveness of torture techniques without violating federal human rights laws. So no such study was undertaken. The U.S. government did not even make an attempt at research. That same report confirms that the CIA conducted no, quote, significant research to identify effective interrogation practices. Combined with the Bush administration's use of torture, we have an incoherent, labyrinthian sort of logic. The administration did not know the efficacy of torture because torturing people was illegal, so they went ahead and tortured people. In the early 2000s, legal counsel to the Bush administration, John Yoo, once commented, "Torture works. We know it does. The CIA says it does, and the vice president says it does." Unfortunately for you, the CIA, the vice president, and grandly more so for those who were tortured by that administration, this statement was incorrect. Torture is not effective. So we have the pro-torture argument constructed with three pieces: a simple interpretation of the human mind, ticking time bomb hypotheticals, and a lack of evidence to refute the efficacy of violent interrogations. As we individually assess these three pillars, though, they are revealed to be quite flimsy. First, the folksy understanding that fuels torture is, in fact, tremendously incorrect. There are many other examples of this faulty knowledge in modern culture. You do not only use 10% of your brain. Schizophrenics do not have split personalities. Human memory is actually a really bad source of information, etc., etc. The idea that torture is effective should and can be slotted in alongside these common misconceptions. In essence, a torturer is trying to get a detainee to recollect and betray something from memory. There has been massive amounts of research done on human cognition, memory, and stress. As Shane O'Mare reported in his paper, Torturing the Brain, everything we know about the human brain suggests that torture is entirely counterproductive. The prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are the parts of the brain which are linked to memory retrieval. Experiencing stress causes a massive release of stress hormones like cortisol and noradrenaline. Both the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are very rich in receptors to these hormones. As these parts of the brain become flooded by cortisol and noradrenaline, they significantly lose their ability to function, and they can even actively lose tissue. Again, it is precisely these two parts of the brain which control memory retrieval. All this together means that a stressful interrogation or outright torture actually compromises the part of the brain which the torturer is trying to access and engage. So on the most foundational biochemical level, torture simply cannot work. The attempt to brute force a mind for information through violence destroys the part of the brain which can access that information. This is not just theory. Brain imaging of torture survivors has revealed huge abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. During an interrogation, this problem can manifest in a few ways, one of which is called confabulation. This is the process of producing false memories, which is a common side effect of extreme stress on the brain. High levels of stress hormones can also lead to the simple inability to recall memories. So torture, rather than revealing information, can actually create false information and destroy genuine memories. Furthermore, in a torture situation, we must remember the captive's only motivation is to escape the extreme stress. In classical psychology, things which promise an escape from a stress situation are called safety signals. For the detainee, the safety signal in an interrogation is not really true, factual information, but the act of speaking something, verbally communicating some kind of information. While a detainee is speaking, they are not being tortured. So the factuality of the detainee's words is not the safety signal, but the words themselves. The result then, of course, becomes information that probably isn't true. If our torturers act based on this information, the perils are numerous. Best case scenario, we have a huge waste of resources, money, and time spent on some wild goose chase, along with the senseless torture of one individual. Worst case scenario, well, the mind can scarcely imagine how bad things could get. There's also the rather obvious fact that different people have varying pain tolerances. The Algerian War of Independence was a conflict between France and the Algerian Liberation Front in the mid-20th century. During the war, the French military engaged in a top-down, intentional campaign of torture on Algerian fighters. Time and time again, they found that Algerians were unaffected by tortures which would destroy affluent Europeans. The French pointed to a combination of factors. Hardcore revolutionaries were immensely stubborn because of their profound belief in their cause. Torturing these Algerians only seemed to strengthen their resolution. This was quite a problem because it was precisely these people who could have provided the most useful information. For the peasant class, the French experienced a similar resistance. They noted that the extraordinary and various hardships of life as an Algerian peasant meant these men were well suited to resist the physical pains of torture. For an interrogator, the natural response to this is simple. If a person is highly tolerant of pain, you can simply issue more. Unfortunately, this doesn't really bear out in reality. The cultural idea of torture tells us that pain is some sort of scale, with some abstract unit of measurement. If a little pain doesn't get someone to talk, we can add more and thus increase the likelihood of that person divulging information. But this isn't really how pain works. As the body becomes more damaged, its ability to feel pain declines remarkably. Survivors of torture have attested to this precisely. A man who was forced to stand for a long time noted, "I lost all power of feeling." One man who was the subject of acid burns said he, quote, felt nothing. Another victim said that through the torture, quote, your whole upper torso becomes numb. It's a relief. You feel no more pain. A man who had his flesh burned with a torch said, did not hurt too much because I was so feeble that I did not care. Even most damningly, one torture survivor noted, a beating is not effective torture because after the first few blows, you don't feel anything. Furthermore, pain is basically an umbrella term which can describe a large number of feelings: burning, searing, throbbing, aching, cutting, etc. Victims have often recalled these different sensations playing against one another in a beneficial way. One man noted that he had a finger from his left hand severed, then one from his right. But at this point he did not feel double the pain. Instead, the pain from his right hand simply eliminated that from his left. So altogether, we have a compounding sort of failure. Torturing a person destroys the parts of the brain that handle information retrieval. The people interrogators most want to question are likely the most resistant to pain. Anyways, more injury does not create more pain, just the opposite, in fact. So we can see that the folkloric idea of torture and how it works is really quite misled. Returning to the French-Algerian conflict, the French ultimately lost their war, with its top military officials proclaiming their torturous endeavors as a waste of time and resources. In fact, in an extensive look at records from the conflict, researcher Darius Rajali found that, quote, no rank-and-file soldier has related an incident in which he personally, through timely interrogation, produced information that averted a loss of life. There is also the ticking time bomb scenario we discussed. Although seemingly straightforward, this scenario at its core is pure deceit. This is for two reasons. As we assess the ticking time bomb idea, we discover how tremendously outlandish it is. In this hypothetical, we know with absolute certainty that the captive is responsible for the bomb. We also know for a fact that he does know where the bomb is, and we know with absolute certainty that torturing him will produce the correct information and will allow us to defuse said explosive. We further have knowledge about every single minute detail regarding the impending threat: time of detonation, the group responsible, even the manufacturing and planning of the bomb. Our intelligence reports are absolutely comprehensive, and we know every pinpoint truth regarding our threat. Yet somehow, we bizarrely lack the one piece of information that truly matters: the location of the bomb. This simply does not make sense. In fact, researchers have combed through history and contemporary record and have produced no examples of a ticking time bomb scenario ever actually having occurred. Such a situation, as described, has never happened and almost certainly never will. So we have a hypothetical which proves tremendously advantageous to torturers. Simply ignore reality and torture becomes easy to justify. Indeed, people like those in the Bush administration have justified torture with versions of this tale. In a speech on September 6, 2006, George Bush claimed that, quote, alternative interrogation techniques had yielded crucial information on the War on Terror. As third parties investigated these claims, they found them to be untrue. The information produced by these alternative interrogations was worthless, or more often obtained through non-torturous methods. Bush's speech was highly publicized. These fact checks were not. Another issue with the ticking time bomb scenario is that it implies torture will only be used in this single instance. But again, real life impedes upon the idea. If a government authorizes torture in this scenario, then other torture is sure to follow in contexts vastly different from the ticking time bomb. The use of torture legitimizes the use of torture. We saw this in our earlier discussion regarding the War on Terror, where exactly such a phenomenon occurred. The ticking time bomb idea also lends to a torture expansion in another direction. Some people may say that the exact scenario as presented is unrealistic, but then follow with the idea that maybe there is some flexibility. We could torture if we are not 100% certain the detainee knows the location of the bomb. Or we could torture if we are not 100% certain that such a bomb even exists. To be even more bold, others may argue we can torture the man just to get information about his cause or organization more broadly. And so the detainee's crime, assuming one does exist, gives us license to torture across a wide variety of circumstances. The scenario kind of multiplies itself in a cancerous way. We can torture this person ad infinitum based on increasingly vague notions of his bomb and his plot. It is true that there is a lack of research and study on the act of torture. This defense of torture is grounded in reality, but there exist volumes of research on adjacent phenomena which, taken together, add up to a picture that is not beneficial for the torturers. To violently interrogate someone successfully, insofar as such a thing is possible, requires that the interrogator is able to identify lies. But as it turns out, humans are remarkably bad at detecting falsehoods. A 1980 survey of all available scholarly data revealed that people tasked with detecting truth and deception have an accuracy rate of about 57%. This is remarkably low, considering that 50% would be the same as flipping a coin. A more recent survey, which included 39 studies published after 1980, found similar results, an accuracy rate of about 56.6%. Studies have also revealed that people have an even lower success rate specifically for identifying lies. When only asked to identify deceit, people have a success rate of around 44%, which is, of course, even worse than flipping a coin. Considering that torture victims have tremendous reason to lie, this is quite the problem. Of course, interrogators are not members of the general population. They are trained professionals, so logic follows that they must have higher rates of success in this area. This has been true in a few cases. In some studies, police accuracy rates range between 45 and 60%. Secret Service members scored higher with 64%. CIA agents even better with 73%. But we should keep in mind that the zero score for this test is really 50%, since that would represent a chance level of success. With this in mind, and considering we are dealing with a horrific violation of human rights, even a 73% success rate becomes only moderately impressive. If we are just 23% more likely to succeed than if we flipped a coin, it becomes hard to argue that torture is effective enough to be justified. Furthermore, this 73% success rate represents only the CIA, who are not the ones engaging in military torture. There exists a book by Fred Inbow and John Reed called Criminal Interrogation and Confession. Although it first appeared in 1942, the book has been revised time and time again. Today, the manual is the global standard procedure for interrogations. The United States and many other countries officially use Inbow and Reed's methods for interrogation. In 2004, Dutch researcher Alder Vree published a study on the Reed technique. He examined police in familiar settings with high-stakes situations and suspects they would typically interrogate. the results were damning. Police who had extensive interrogation experience fared only slightly better than novices. Those police who followed the Reed method were, in fact, worse at detecting lies. Even more remarkably, the more closely police followed this method, the worse they became at interrogation. Despite all of this, I still do not feel we have really defeated the concept of torture. Most people abstractly agree that torture is bad, but it is often funneled into the category of a necessary evil, which carries the implication that violent interrogation, although ethically dubious, produces results. In reality, torture is one of the least effective methods of producing good information. This is not just my opinion. Even military manuals from around the world, which support the use of torture, caution that it is one of the worst ways to gather intelligence. The Japanese manual notes for the interrogation of prisoners of war reads, "Care must be exercised when making use of rebukes, incentives, or torture, as it will result in his telling falsehoods and making a fool of you." An Indonesian interrogation manual says, quote, "The use of force often has the consequence that the person being interrogated under duress confesses falsely because he is afraid, and as a consequence agrees to everything the interrogator wishes." One CIA counterintelligence manual declares, "Intense pain is quite likely to produce false confessions, concocted as a means of escaping from distress." The U.S. Army Field Manual, in a section titled Intelligence Interrogations, describes the following. "At best, use of force is a poor technique since it may induce the subject to tell what he thinks the interrogator wants to hear. The subject may not possess the information sought, but he will fabricate information to please the interrogator and bring an end to the force being applied." This isn't exactly a new development either. A Chinese legal text dated to circa 217 reads, "Obtaining the facts of the person without using violence is best. Applying violence is inferior, for when there is fear, everything is spoiled." In pre-revolutionary France, prosecutors sought confessions for a total of 785 cases. They used typical torturous methods of the era: bone crushing, stomach pumping, burning, thumb screws, etc. In Paris, these prosecutors achieved a confession rate between 3 and 9%. Across other provinces, the highest achieved rate was just 14.2%. One of the reasons for this is that torture broadly sows disdain and erodes trust. Public cooperation, by contrast, is one of the most effective ways for authorities to gain information. When we look at policing in America, we see that unless a member of the public willingly identifies a suspect, the chance of a crime being solved is about 10%. Still, we may be tempted to say that these numbers are not zero. Surely, something is better than nothing. But in fact, torture has a tremendous tendency to produce information that is much worse than nothing. That is untrue information. The problem exists even more severely if the captive in fact has no information at all. In such a case, they will very likely lie to stop the torture. They may give the name of someone they hate in a desire to settle a petty feud. They may give a random name, location, or information. Whatever the case may be, the investigators are now loaded with a bevy of false information to act upon. In this case, nothing would have certainly been better than something. Despite all of this, there is one vaguely cultural notion which acts as a pro-torture argument. This sentiment, I'm sure, will be represented in the comments section of this video. That is some version of the idea that liberals with weak constitutions just don't want to deal with the darker realities of life, that torture does work, and bleeding heart sensibilities are just grasping for ways to ignore some frightening reality. I don't know that this is the best argument for torture. In fact, I would say it's perhaps the worst. But it is strangely the hardest to defeat. This sort of argument is one not based in reality. It is one that in fact rejects reality. It is like arguing that dogs are actually cats, or that a can of Coca-Cola is a pack of cigarettes. If a person chooses to argue a point in this way, in a matter which is effectively plucked from thin air, what are we to do? I don't really know. I think all we can do is act with resilience and have some hope that truth will ultimately prevail. A lot of these statistics, research, and work cited up to this point have been historical. It may occur to a person that technology changes, methods evolve, and perhaps torture can be improved over time. Just because it has failed historically does not mean it will fail forever, a person may say. So we would do well to investigate this idea. Let's imagine a scenario in which torture is regulated, frameworked, and only used under the strictest sort of governance. Let us cast off all the problems with torture and imagine this hypothetical. After all, there exists police brutality, but there also exists policing in a professional manner. Could the same be said for torture? The answer is no, it cannot. Torture inherently causes unprofessionalism. When an administration authorizes the use of torture, they do so with a rule book of approved techniques. While a nice idea, this has proven to be immensely ineffective. In practice, torturers generally go far outside of the bounds of these approved methods. We can look at any number of examples: the Khmer Rouge, Abu Ghraib, the Nazi Gestapo, the French in Algeria. All of these regimes published approved methods and then implemented torture techniques which didn't resemble their regulations in the slightest. In the 1980s, CIA manuals were taught throughout South America which contained US-approved torture techniques. In Texas, the CIA instructed an interrogator named Florencio Caballero. They showed him methods which were limited to body positioning and sweating. But Caballero's unit quickly adopted the practices of electrocution and flesh burning. He later said, quote, "Somehow it had all gone wrong, even though it started well, even though the Americans had good ideas." It's not hard to deduce how this happens. The victims of torture become numb with the compounding initial methods, so the torturers move to more intense techniques. As Darius Rajali points out, this is not because torturers are sadists or zealots. In fact, these sorts of interrogators just cause disciplinary problems. Instead, organizations recruit stable people for the act of interrogation. Then, through the breakdown of regulation, these people act as sadists and zealots. This is precisely what occurred at Abu Ghraib prison. Interrogators also have another thing at play: their career, their ambitions. While it is nice to think that soldiers or police are working together for some greater cause, the role is an occupation. So there exist more private motivations. People want to advance in their field. They want admiration, pay raises, or respect from their superiors. To get these things, to do a good job, an interrogator must be the one who breaks the prisoner. There is very little shared credit in such a process. One interrogator gets the job done while his colleague does not. There is competition. One French torturer noted each interrogator, quote, "thinks he is going to get the information and takes good care not to let the bird go to the next chap, when of course the other chap would get the honor and glory of it." Similar statements have been made by Soviets, Indonesians, and other torturers around the globe. Like any other job based on personal merit, the task of torture creates tunnel vision. Each individual interrogator focuses on his or her task as the end point itself, rather than seeing the broader cause. Anyone who has held any job has surely witnessed this firsthand. Even in the most mundane occupations, employees develop shortcuts and habits to make their work easier. People who work in corporations regularly prioritize their own interests or projects over some broader company mission. Politicians act selfishly, motivated by personal success rather than the strengthening of a nation. Military positions are not immune to this phenomenon. As a result, informal codes of conduct emerge as subcultural elements in intelligence organizations. Even American police today operate with their own unwritten code, which is largely removed from any official regulations. The same happens with other military organizations, as one U.S. Special Forces major noted. Quote, "Units were on their own wavelength. You have two parallel chains of command, and one could wind up doing what they felt like doing." This is in part what led to the atrocities at Abu Ghraib. The Bush administration issued their declarations, and soldiers on the ground operated independently of these platitudes. When organizations use torture as a weapon, it also leads to a tremendous de-skilling. The fact is that torturing someone is much less laborious than not torturing. To spend time on other modes of intelligence gathering requires careful surveillance, interviewing, fact-checking, and analysis. It's just easier to torture people. This fact is hardly new. In the India Evidence Act of 1872, English lawyer Sir James Fitzjames noted, "It is far pleasanter to sit comfortably in the shade rubbing pepper into a poor devil's eyes than go out in the sun hunting up evidence." In more modern times, the CIA's Human Resources Exploitation Training Manual says, "The routine use of torture lowers the moral caliber of the organization that uses it, and corrupts those that rely on it as the quick and easy way out." Torture, when instituted from the top down, becomes little more than a clumsy shortcut which overtakes more labor-intensive, expensive, and difficult investigatory work. With all of this in mind, the idea of somehow professionally torturing an individual is fiction. It is at best a scenario which inherently leads to unprofessional torture. Torture is one of the many concepts in the world that exists for 99.9999% of individuals as mere abstract. It is almost not even an action, but an idea. Very few people will be tortured or will torture anyone else. This lends to another problem: the intentional corruption, manipulation, and distortion of torture itself by bad actors. Because it is so abstract to most people, the concept of torture can be molded to suit the needs of any individual or party. And indeed, this has happened. Governments like the Bush administration and others have shifted the very meaning of torture through clever public relations work. As researcher Gabby Schlag has noted, top-down attempts to justify torture generally follow a three-step protocol. First, agents cast the anti-torture ideology against fictitious, cut-and-dry hypotheticals like the ticking time bomb scenario. They proclaim that there are indeed extraordinary circumstances which call for torture. Second, these agents then distinguish carefully between torture and ill treatment, sometimes coining new terms like the Bush administration's now famous enhanced interrogation verbiage. As they do so, they create a new category for interrogation techniques, which is vague enough to include a huge range of conduct. Meanwhile, they categorize isolated, indisputable incidents of pure torture as unprofessional aberrations. Third, the agents then reaffirm the prohibition of certain horrific tortures while minimizing discussion of others. They point to extreme tortures and affirm they are not engaging in anything like that. They declare that assaulting someone's anus with a broomstick is surely unacceptable torture. On the other hand, something which is ostensibly less severe, like waterboarding or sleep deprivation, becomes an entirely different thing. Therefore, it is not torture. In reality, these latter methods are in fact torture, but this arbitrary distinction works to legitimize them as interrogation techniques. Acting agents may also deceitfully cherry-pick instances of these so-proclaimed less severe methods being effective. In 2007, CIA intelligence officer John Kiriakou claimed in an ABC News interview that waterboarding al-Qaeda members produced information which stopped, quote, dozens of attacks. The Washington Post later revealed Kurakow's claims were exaggerated at best and pure fabrication at worst. In the late 90s, there was a reported story that Philippine police tortured information from an Al-Qaeda member and foiled a plot to blow up 11 U.S. passenger jets. The numerous international news articles about this conveniently ignored that police had discovered the bomb plot, in fact, by seizing the man's computer at time of arrest, long before they had ever tortured him. This three-step program was basically the Bush administration's playbook surrounding the Abu Ghraib controversy. On the whole, it is an attempt to realign cultural norms, to proclaim what was wrong is now right, what was unthinkable is now quite regular. Another method for shifting norms is through popular culture. Because torture is such an abstract, malleable concept, it is easy to manipulate the public in this way. Media depictions of severe interrogation are typically formulaic of a torture myth. Often in media, torture will lead to reliable information and a confession. The interrogator is typically presented as a man in struggle who feels compelled to act because of extraordinary circumstances. He or she is rarely, if ever, a pure sadist. Sometimes there will be witnesses to the torture who express similar sentiments. They have doubts and regrets, but acknowledge the necessity of the violence. The pain of the detainee is typically shown as essential to the ultimate confession, while his motivations for his crimes are left unmentioned. To be more precise, the television show 24 was emblematic and symbolic of the global war on terror. It represented torture as acceptable, legitimate, and necessary. In fact, high-ranking members of the U.S. government, like advisor John Yoo, co-author of the Patriot Act Michael Chertoff, Staff Judge Advocate Diane Beaver, or Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, all referred to 24 to normalize and excuse torture. Unfortunately, this is not too remarkable. Many pieces of media function in the same way. For the U.S. administration, eliminating al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden was a watershed moment in the so-titled global war on terror. He was perceived as the mastermind and figurehead of al-Qaeda, and thus the 9/11 attacks. Zero Dark 30 is a movie which tells the story of the CIA's search for bin Laden. It was released in December of 2012, about 18 months after he was found and killed. Where genre is concerned, we may be right to refer to the movie as a docudrama. The movie exists in a strange middle ground between fact and fiction. This obfuscation is so blatant that the film has been called an exercise in instant history and hot after-the-fact myth-making. We would also be right to call Zero Dark 30 a piece of propaganda. The movie is a masterclass in pro-torture norm shifting and the general blurring of truth. Zero Dark 30 opens with a commemorative tribute to the victims of 9/11, which is undeniably affecting. Immediately following this, we are taken to the torturing of the film's protagonist, an al-Qaeda member named Ammar. Here, the implication is clear. The torture is an act of retribution for 9/11. Torture thus is not an action, but a reaction, a consequence. This becomes immediately much more blatant. Zero Dark 30 is very careful to confirm to the viewer that Ammar does indeed deserve to be tortured. When he asks why he is being tortured, the American captor replies, quote, "You're a terrorist. That's why I'm doing it to you." This tells the viewer that Ammar is certainly guilty, and thus is deserving of inhumane treatment. Ammar's stated mission in the movie ignores geopolitical motivations, but instead is simplified when he says, "I wanted to kill Americans." Zero Dark 30 does not indicate that torture was or is endorsed by the U.S. government. Instead, the film's effectiveness is in its ambivalence. As one character engages in torturous techniques, another watches on with disgust, but does not express any doubts to the necessity of the work. In the film, torture is shown as a strategic, tactical method for gaining crucial intelligence. Techniques like waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and sexualized abuse are put in the context of a successful hunt for Osama bin Laden. The film portrays torture as a necessary and legitimate tool in capturing bin Laden, and thus in making progress in the global war on terror. All the while, the film ignores any incisive context of that war, the Iraq invasion, or the broader consequences of torture. More directly, the film is careful to note that the Obama administration is opposed to the torturous acts of the protagonists. The film touches on the public-facing controversy around American torture of detainees. This allows the administration to have its cake and eat it too. They can engage in torturous methods while also being abdicated of guilt. Torture, by Zero Dark 30 logic, may not be legally justified, but it is morally. The CIA eagerly cooperated with the filmmakers and writers behind Zero Dark 30. The production team was granted, quote, unprecedented access to classified details about CIA operations. Conversely, CIA agents and military officials reviewed and critiqued the movie before release, with some reports indicating that the CIA had some scenes deleted or altered. This is just one example, but films like Zero Dark 30 come around relatively often, seeking to shift norms and influence public opinion quite blatantly. This is not to plunge this essay into uncovering some covert en masse effort by the US government to legitimize torture through cultural production, though such a thing may exist in shades. Instead, it is to point at the dangers of torture existing as such a malleable concept. Torture is an immensely tricky subject because it so often must be discussed through hypotheticals and fictitious philosophizing. Jamie Mayerfield from the University of Illinois discussed this in a recent paper. Usually the question of should we or shouldn't we is at the contested heart of the torture conversation. But each time we approach the subject, we chip away at the taboo nature of the topic. Torture becomes less unthinkable and slowly drifts into a realm of perfectly normal. Perhaps this is fair enough. Torture is not just a fiction, it is real. However, as it becomes more normalized in discourse, it becomes more normalized in action. As a side effect of this, we become desensitized to the reality of torture. Like a teenager who spends too much time watching gore videos or pornography online, we forget about the real world. Those things which are so remarkable become quite unremarkable. As an idea, be it torture or anything else, drifts into the theoretical, it is also susceptible to the implantation of false ideas and corruption by untruths. We construct examples and scenarios which ignore the realities of the world, scenarios like that of the ticking time bomb. When we exist in these sorts of worlds, it is easy for us to make the right call. We can ignore the realities of the human brain, of human behavior, of anything at all, just to achieve a nice, tidy picture. When we combine this with emotionally charged rhetoric and scenarios, it becomes very easy to form torture into something good. As I reach the end of this writing, it strikes me as a strange feeling to spend so much time arguing that torture is bad. It is strange to me that it requires an hour-long explanation to declare that it is wrong to rape a person with a fluorescent light bulb, to beat a man until he dies of a heart attack, or to waterboard a person for 200 hours. I do not really know why this is. I am unable to diagnose the problem here, but I am certain, very certain, that an equally robust explanation for justifying torture cannot exist. There isn't enough material or evidence to do such a thing. There is no method for justifying torture, not one which is grounded in anything beyond savage, primal, and imaginary explanation. When we deal instead with facts, science, and research, we arrive at a more accurate reality. Torture does not work, nor has it ever, nor will it ever. The most universal and cruel aspect about torture is just that. Those who are tortured for nothing.